Good day, I'm Norman Wildberger. Today we're going to have a look at a portion of the history of logic through the Middle Ages, very roughly, 1,000-year period, from around the fall of Rome to the beginnings of the scientific revolution in Europe. And we're going to be encompassing two different regions. We're going to look at the medieval European developments, as well as the Islamic or Arabic approaches to logic that were developed at this time. So in some sense, this is a secondary period because most of it really rests on the work of Aristotle. So Aristotle's work is dominant throughout this period in both regions. So let's have a look at the general setup. So we're talking about the later part of the Greek period, which is near the end of the Roman times. So up to around 400 AD, that's close to the collapse of Rome. And at that time, up to that time, Aristotle's and the Stoic logic were both very well studied. So there were these two dominant, prominent forms of logic. Okay, and then we had the fall of Rome around 500 AD, a little bit before that. And then ensued what's called sometimes the Dark Ages in Europe. Decline of the civilized heights of Greece and Rome that had been achieved previously. And then the shift of world development turned towards the east, towards the Byzantium, the Holy Roman Empire in the east, and then to the rise of Islam in the Middle East. And then eventually later around 1500, Europe starts to emerge into the scientific revolution, and then there's all kinds of further developments. So we're talking about this general period, what was happening in logic during these years. So one of the key figures in this entire epoch is a fellow called Boethius, who was born in Rome. And he was a Roman senator and also a philosopher. And it was very important that he actually translated works of Aristotle from the Greek into Latin. He wanted some kind of revival of the great Greek glory period around Plato. And so to try to move things in that direction, he translated Aristotle's and other people's works. And it turns out that those translations played a key role in the subsequent development of logic throughout the medieval period. Now, Boethius' story is kind of interesting because he was born and lived in very tumultuous times. So this was a time when Rome was overrun. The Goths, the Huns, the Visigoths. So the Roman Empire finally collapsed just around the time when he was born. And at that time, the first new sort of king from maybe a Hun or Goth king, his name was Odoacer. And he was then the king of Italy and had overtaken Rome. And then there were various intrigues. Another Ostrogoth named Theodoric the Great somehow allied himself with the Eastern Roman Republic, Eastern Roman Empire, and ultimately ended up invading Italy. And at some famous place, these two guys met, and they resolved on a truce to sort of separate Italy between the two of them. And while they were having a banquet dinner to celebrate this truce, Theodoric got out his sword and just killed Odoacer. So now there was no more division. It all belonged to Theodoric. And it turned out that Boethius then ended up being employed by Theodoric to be a consul and to be a political person. But he eventually fell out of favor and ultimately was executed by the same man himself. Okay, so interesting story. So it turns out that his translations, which are really the main contribution that he made some commentary on Aristotle. Typically this was the story. People would translate some works, and then along with the translation they would give some commentary, and they would add some things or give some new angles or examples and so on. So he did that, but really the main thing was his translations. And it turns out that his translations were not uniformly brought into Europe in the later ages. Some of them appeared a long time before the others did. And so the Europeans of 400 or 500 years after him were only in contact with some of his translations, and so they only knew some of Aristotle's work. And that then became known as the Old Logic. And then a few hundred years later, the other translations that he had made became available, and then that ushered in the new logic. So both of these really were consequences of Boethius's work. So in the 500-year period after Boethius, that's generally referred to as the Dark Ages, and intellectually Europe was quite dormant at that time. And the spotlight of scientific intellectual thought turned eastward, and a lot of it was then ultimately focused in the Islamic world. So that all begins with Muhammad the Prophet, who lived from 570 to 632, and then afterwards a very quick spread of Islam into a wide-ranging area. And then we end up not long afterwards having massive empires, basically based around Baghdad, so-called caliphates. And amongst these developments here, the introduction of Greek thinking was very important to the Islamic leaders. They recognized that the ancient Greek works held a lot of knowledge, and so they translated these into Arabic. This was very important because that's how we get a lot of the ancient Greek writings, via the Arab translations. Then they subsequently ended up in Europe, often via Spain. And so that's an important link from the early ancient Greek times to the Western period later on. So the Arabs and generally the Islamic scholars, it wasn't just Arabs, also Persians and other people, they took on board the teachings of Aristotle primarily. So Aristotle was very, very important for them. They studied Aristotle and they interpreted his work, and they put it in the context of Islamic logic. And I guess Islam has a propensity for valuing a logical reasoning. So they took on board these writings of Aristotle. And I'll mention a few people. In particular, one of the first ones was Abu Yusuf al-Kindi. So the Arabic names are often quite long, so we sometimes might just abbreviate them with the last names, al-Kindi, who lived from 801 to 873. And he's often referred to as the father of Arab philosophy, because he sort of was one of the first people to really systematize Islamic philosophy. He worked in a very interesting place called the House of Wisdom, which was a kind of an institute that was set up in Baghdad and that attracted scholars of all kinds in all kinds of areas. And there he interpreted Aristotle's Organon, the important work of logic that Aristotle had written. So al-Kindi was interested in a wide range of things. He wrote a very influential book called On the Use of Indian Numerals, which later on became quite popular in the West and helped to promote this new system of what we call Hindu-Arabic numerals to replace the Roman arithmetic. He tried to reconcile logic and theology. So there was always this question of to what extent did logic either support or perhaps oppose theological issues. He wrote on a wide range of topics, including metaphysics, medicine, optics, astronomy. He was involved in cryptography too, I believe. And I just want to show you this quote, which I think is quite interesting and sort of relevant to our general thrust of moving towards understanding set theory and, infinite sets and all that stuff. So he said, "It is not possible, either for an eternal body or for other objects which have quantity and quality, to be infinite in actuality. Infinity being only in potentiality." So this is not so far from Aristotle's position also, that the infinite, to the extent that it exists, is really an unfolding, a progression, or a potentiality, a possibility. It's not actually something that actually can exist. Okay, so that's a topic that we'll have to talk about more, but already we see this important recognition of this fact in al-Kindi's thinking. So in the Arab studies of logic, the subject was closely connected with language and consequentially with grammar and speech. The syllogisms in the sense of Aristotle, were very central. They played a central role. But they entertained variants, differences, what they called modes, or what we call modes, or types were studied. So a key figure in Arabic logic is Avicenna, who lived from 980 to 1037. And he introduced a lot of innovations and refinements to Aristotle's logic, and in some sense went beyond Aristotle. So the kinds of thinking that he introduced include things like this, ideas of temporal modes. So if we look at a simple proposition, the cat is hungry, there's a subject, there's a predicate, there's a complete sentence, the cat is hungry. Okay, so when we're looking at its modes, it means that we're looking about sort of different flavors or different possible subtleties that could be underneath or hidden or underlying the idea here. So for example, a temporal mode refers to the time in which this is taking place. So are we saying that the cat is hungry all the time? Or maybe we're interested in expressing the idea that the cat is hungry most of the time, or perhaps some of the time. So these are very common kinds of distinctions when we're talking about statements, something happening all the time, some of the time, most of the time. And so how do we incorporate those kind of distinctions or modes into our logic? That was the kind of thing that Avicenna was interested in. So another variant that he studied are things called hypothetical syllogisms. And that refers to constructions where our propositions have if-then kind of clauses or implications involved. So here's an example. Consider the following two statements and then a consequence of those two statements. So the first statement is, if the cat is hungry, it will chase mice. And the second statement is, if the mice are chased, then they are scared. Okay? And the conclusion is that if the cat is hungry, the mice are scared. Okay, so in modern terms, the way we like to express implication, and this really goes back to the Stoic kind of position, because the Stoics were quite happy with this kind of construction. We would say P implies Q, together with Q implies R. From those two premises, it follows that P implies R. Okay, so this is the way we would express the idea. And it's different from Aristotle's syllogisms because the basic statements are not of the kind, all men are mortal, or some cats are hungry. It's if something, then something else. So it turns out that the same kinds of issues were also addressed by the European medieval logicians. The issue is that when we are talking about statements in the real world having to do with people and ethics and the world in which we live in, there are all kinds of subtleties and possible ambiguities in the language that we use. And if we're wanting to be careful about the logical structure of arguments, then we have to address these subtleties. And so sort of teasing out the various possible alternate ways of thinking or stating various things, this is sort of a natural consequence of thinking about this subject. And that's what happened to in the medieval times. Again, now following the Boethius development sort of quite some centuries later. So we ended up developing something called modal logic, which is basically we're thinking about propositions which are qualified in various ways. So we're adding extra distinctions to make them a little bit more subtle. For example, one kind of modality is that of possibilities, or engaging with possibility as a feature of our propositions. So for example, the statement, the country will go to war. Consider the variant of that statement, which is, the country will possibly go to war. Okay. If you kill our ambassador, the country will go to war. If you kill our ambassador, the country will possibly go to war. So those are two different statements. They're in the same direction, but there's definitely a different sense of meaning to them. And perhaps this possibly has a little bit more ambiguity about it than this one here. But nevertheless, it's an interesting alternative. We can explore how does logic look like when we're allowing ourselves to include statements that have this kind of possible ambiguity involved in them. Another kind of modality had to do with something called suppositions, which is describing or trying to get at the range or the domain of applicability of our subjects or predicates. Okay, so for example, the statement, all lions are carnivores. Okay, that's a statement. The lions that we're talking about here, all lions. But is that entirely clear? I mean, there's different possible ways of thinking about what all lions means. For example, what domain of lions are we talking about? Are we talking about fictional? Are we including fictional lions? Are we restricting ourselves to living lions? Are we including dead lions? Is it true that a dead lion is a carnivore? Maybe not. So maybe we need to exclude that one, but we include living. How about future lions? Are all future lions carnivores? Well, how do we know? Maybe lions will be bred slightly differently to be vegetarians. How about baby lions? Are they carnivores? Okay, so there's all these qualifications, and so there's this idea that maybe we should somehow include the domains of applicability, the domains in which we are trying to make statements, to make them more precise, to make them less ambiguous. So this is the theory of suppositions, and that was an important development in medieval logic. People wrote books about how to address this and how to set it up and what happened. So between the years of 500 and 1000 or 1100, not much intellectually was happening in Europe, to be honest. But around this time, things started to reboot a little bit, and some more logicians started looking again at the works of Aristotle via Boethius. And one of the first was Peter Abelard, who lived from 1079 to 1142, and he made commentary on Aristotle and also another logician whose name is Porphyry. It's very hard to pronounce that one. And so he was one of the earlier commentators on Aristotle, but he didn't have all of Aristotle's works. He only had some of the translations of Boethius, and then subsequently new translations or new copies of the translations that Boethius had made became available, and so then there was a kind of a new logic where the other works of Aristotle were then available. The Stoic works were really not part of this picture, and mostly because Boethius didn't translate them, sadly. So we don't have a lot of record of them, and neither did the Europeans. One of the works that became available was a book by Aristotle called Sophistic Refutations, in which he discusses fallacies, how fallacies are generated, how to avoid them, but maybe also how to use them to win debates and to identify weaknesses in the opponent's arguments. So the study of fallacies also became a popular subject in medieval logic. Another important figure is William of Ockham, who is famous for Ockham's razor, lived from 1285 to 1347, and he wrote a summary of logic. So he was also an early major contributor to logic and textbook on it. And I suppose the culminating figure in this time was a French philosopher named Jean Buridan, who lived from 1300 to 1358. He was a student of William of Ockham, but ultimately ended up rejecting William's thoughts and went in a different direction. There was a bit of a schism there. So he actually worked in mechanics and philosophy also. He was an early realizer that Aristotle's physics, in terms of the trajectories of particles and the laws of motion, were probably not entirely correct. And so he realized, for example, that air resistance would slow down a particle. You have to take that into consideration. So he further developed, along with William of Ockham, the theory of consequences. It's another sort of medieval addition to Aristotle's work, which includes if-then statements. So really going back to the Stoic constructions, and that also had been studied by the Arabs. But to the medievalists, this was a novel thing. So for example, if a man runs, then God exists. This kind of statement is then incorporated into his work. Here's the Latin for it: si homo currit, Deus est. Because they all wrote in Latin. Okay, so there were actually quite a few people, many people who wrote books on logic, who made contributions. There was a strong connection with theology, so naturally these are very theologically strong times, and so you wanted to have your logic accord with doctrine. But still there was a lot of work in this direction. But probably the truth is that after Buridan, this classical logic went through a long decline. That it became less and less interesting and relevant to subsequent generations. And when we get to the scientific revolution, which is really the next step, they really abandoned largely the classical logic and said, well, that's all sterile and boring. We need to go in different directions. We need to think about things in a new way, because they were new thinking people. And so that's actually quite an interesting development. What happens, perhaps starting with Leibniz and then moving up into the 19th century developments of Boole and De Morgan. So that's quite interesting. I hope you'll join me for that. I'm Norman Wildberger. Thanks for listening.